Chapter 1. When Jason Gridley got in touch with me recently by radio and told me it was the year of our Lord 1939 on the outer crust, I could scarcely believe him, for it seemed scarcely any time at all since Abner Perry and I bored our way through the Earth's crust to the inner world in the great iron mole that Perry had invented for the purpose of prospecting for minerals just beneath the surface of the Earth. It rather floored me to realize that we have been down here in Pellucidar for 36 years. You see, in a world where there are no stars and no moon, and a stationary sun hangs constantly at zenith, there is no way to compute time, and so there is no such thing as time. I have come to believe that this is really true, because neither Perry nor I show any physical evidence of the passage of time. I was 20 when the iron mole broke through the crust of Pellucidar, and I don't look nor feel a great deal older now. When I reminded Perry that he was 101 years old, he nearly threw a fit. He said it was perfectly ridiculous and that Jason Gridley must have been hoaxing me. Then he brightened up and called my attention to the fact that I was 56. 56. Well, perhaps I should have been had I remained in Connecticut, but I'm still in my 20s down here. When I look back at all that has happened to us at the Earth's core, I realize that a great deal more time has elapsed than has been apparent to us. We have seen so much. We have done so much. We have lived. We couldn't have crowded half of it into a lifetime on the outer crust. We have lived in the Stone Age, Perry and I, two men of the 20th century, and we have brought some of the blessings of the 20th century to these men of the Old Stone Age. They used to kill each other with stone hatchets and stone-shod spears before we came, and only a few tribes had even bows and arrows, but we have taught them how to make gunpowder and rifles and cannon, and they are commencing to realize the advantages of civilization. I shall never forget, though, Perry's first experiments with gunpowder. When he got it perfected, he was so proud you couldn't hold him. "Look at it," he cried, as he exhibited a quantity of it for my inspection. "Feel of it. Smell of it. Taste it. This is the proudest day of my life, David. This is the first step toward civilization, and a long one." Well, it certainly did seem to have all the physical attributes of gunpowder, but it must have lacked some of its spirit, for it wouldn't burn. Outside of that, it was pretty good gunpowder. Perry was crushed, but he kept on experimenting, and after a while he produced an article that would kill anybody. And then there was the beginning of the battle fleet. Perry and I built the first ship on the shores of a nameless sea. It was a flat-bottom contraption that bore a startling resemblance to an enormous coffin. Perry is a scientist. He had never built a ship and knew nothing about ship design, but he contended that because he was a scientist, and therefore a highly intelligent man, he was fitted to tackle the problem from a scientific basis. We built it on rollers, and when it was finished we started it down the beach toward the water. It sailed out magnificently for a couple of 100 feet, and then turned over. Once again Perry was crushed, but he kept doggedly at it, and eventually we achieved a navy of sailing ships that permitted us to dominate the seas of our little corner of this great, mysterious inner world, and spread civilization and sudden death to an extent that amazed the natives. When I left Sari on this expedition I am about to tell you of, Perry was trying to perfect poison gas. He claimed that it would do even more to bring civilization to the Old Stone Age. Chapter 2. The natives of Pellucidar are endowed with a homing instinct that verges on the miraculous, and believe me, they need it. For no man could find his way anywhere here if he were transported beyond sight of a familiar landmark unless he possessed this instinct. And this is quite understandable when you visualize a world with a stationary sun hanging always at zenith, a world where there are neither moon nor stars to guide the traveler, a world where because of these things there is no north, nor south, nor east, nor west. It was this homing instinct of my companions that led me into the adventures I am about to narrate. When we set out from Sari to search for von Horst, we followed vague clues that led us hither and yon from one country to another until finally we reached Lohar and found our man. But returning to Sari, it was not necessary to retrace our devious way. Instead, we moved in as nearly a direct line as possible, detouring only where natural obstacles seemed insurmountable. It was a new world to all of us, and as usual, I found it extremely thrilling to view for the first time these virgin scenes that, perhaps, no human eye had ever looked upon before. This was adventure at its most glorious pinnacle. My whole being was stirred by the spirit of the pioneer and the explorer. But how unlike my first experiences in Pellucidar, when Perry and I wandered aimlessly and alone in this savage world of colossal beasts, of hideous reptiles and of savage men. Now I was accompanied by a band of my own Sarians armed with rifles fabricated under Perry's direction in the arsenal that he had built in the land of Sari near the shore of the Lural Az. Even the mighty Arwaij, the monstrous cave bear that once roamed the prehistoric outer crust, held no terrors for us, while the largest of the dinosaurs proved no match against our bullets. We made long marches after leaving Lohar, sleeping quite a number of times, which is the only way by which time may be even approximately measured, without encountering a single human being. The land across which we traveled was a paradise peopled only by wild beasts. Great herds of antelope, red deer, and the mighty bos roamed fertile plains or lay in the cool shade of the park-like forests. We saw the mighty mammoth and huge mai, the mastodon, and naturally where there was so much flesh, there were the flesh-eaters, the pteryg, the mighty saber-toothed tiger, the great cave lions and various types of carnivorous dinosaurs. It was an ideal hunter's paradise, but there were only beasts there to hunt other beasts. Man had not yet come to bring discord to this living idol. These beasts were absolutely unafraid of us, but they were inordinately curious, and occasionally we were surrounded by such great numbers of them as to threaten our safety. These of course were all herbivorous animals. The flesh-eaters avoided us when their bellies were full, but they were always dangerous at all times. After we crossed this great plain we entered a forest beyond which we could see mountains in the far distance. We slept twice in the forest, and then came into a valley down which ran a wide river which flowed out of the foothills of the mountains we had seen. The great river flowed sluggishly past us down toward some unknown sea, and as it was necessary to cross it I set my men at work building rafts. These Pellucidarian rivers, especially the large ones with a sluggish current, are extremely dangerous to cross because they are peopled more often than not by hideous carnivorous reptiles, such as have been long extinct upon the outer crust. Many of these are large enough to have easily wrecked our raft, and so we kept a close watch upon the surface of the water as we pulled our crude craft toward the opposite shore. It was because our attention was thus focused that we did not notice the approach of several canoes loaded with warriors, coming downstream toward us from the foothills, until one of my men discovered them and gave the alarm when they were only a matter of a couple of 100 yards from us. I hoped that they would prove friendly, as I had no desire to kill them, for primitively armed as they were, they would be helpless in the face of our rifles, and so I gave the sign of peace, hoping to see it acknowledged in kind upon their part, but they made no response. Closer and closer they came, until I could see them quite plainly. They were heavy-built, stocky warriors with bushy beards, a rather uncommon sight in Pellucidar where most of the pure-blood white tribes are beardless. When they were about 100 feet from us, their canoes all abreast, a number of warriors rose in the bow of each boat and opened fire upon us. I say, opened fire, from force of habit. As a matter of fact what they did was to project dart-like missiles at us from heavy slingshots. Some of my men went down, and immediately I gave the order to fire. I could see by their manner how astonished the bearded warriors were at the sound and effect of the rifles, but I will say for them that they were mighty courageous, for though the sound and the smoke must have been terrifying they never hesitated, but came on toward us even more rapidly. Then they did something that I had never seen done before nor since in the inner world. They lighted torches, made of what I afterward learned to be a resinous reed, and hurled them among us. These torches gave off volumes of acrid black smoke that blinded and choked us. By the effects that the smoke had upon me, I know what it must have had upon my men, but I can only speak for myself because blinded and choking I was helpless. I could not see the enemy, and so I could not fire at them in self-defense. I wanted to jump into the river and escape the smoke, but I knew that if I did that I should be immediately devoured by the ferocious creatures lurking beneath the surface. I felt myself losing consciousness, and then hands seized me, and I knew that I was being dragged somewhere just as consciousness left me. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying bound in the bottom of a canoe among the hairy legs of the warriors who had captured me. Above me, and rather close on either hand, I could see rocky cliffs, so I knew that we were paddling through a narrow gorge. I tried to sit up, but one of the warriors kicked me in the face with a sandaled foot and pushed me down again. They were discussing the battle in loud, gruff voices, shouting back and forth the length of the boat as first one and then another sought to make himself heard and express his individual theory as to the strange weapon that shot fire and smoke with a thunderous noise and dealt death at a great distance. I could easily understand them, as they spoke the language that is common to all human beings in Pellucidar, insofar as I know, for I have never heard another. Why all races and tribes, no matter how far separated, speak this one language I do not know. It has always been a mystery to both Perry and myself. Perry suggests that it may be a basic, primitive language that people living in the same environment with identical problems and surroundings would naturally develop to express their thoughts. Perhaps he is right, I do not know. But it is as good an explanation as any. They kept on arguing about our weapons and getting nowhere, until finally the warrior who had kicked me in the face said, "The prisoner has got his senses back. He can tell us how sticks can be made to give forth smoke and flame and kill warriors a long way off." "We can make him give us the secret," said another, "and then we can kill all the warriors of Jeff and Julok and take all their men for ourselves." I was a little puzzled by that remark, for it seemed to me that if they killed all the warriors there would be no men left, and then as I looked more closely at my bearded, hairy captors, the strange, the astounding truth suddenly dawned upon me. These warriors were not men, they were women. "Who wants any more men?" said another. "I don't. Those that I have give me enough trouble, gossiping, nagging, never doing their work properly. After a hard day hunting or fighting, I get all worn out beating them after I get home." "The trouble with you, Rump," said a third. "You're too easy with your men. You let them run all over you." Rump was the lady who had kicked me in the face. She may have been a soft-hearted creature, but she didn't impress me as such from my brief acquaintance with her. She had legs like a pro football guard, and ears like a cannoneer. I couldn't imagine her letting anyone get away with anything because of a soft heart. "Well," she replied, "all I can say, Fudge, is that if I had such a mean-spirited set of weaklings as your men are, I might not have as much trouble, but I like a little spirit in my men." "Don't say anything about my men," shouted Fudge, as she aimed a blow at Rump's head with a paddle. Rump dodged and sat up in the boat reaching for her slingshot, when a stentorian voice from the stern of the canoe shouted, "Sit down and shut up." I looked in the direction of the voice to see a perfectly enormous brute of a creature with a bushy black beard and close-set eyes. One look at her explained why the disturbance ceased immediately and Rump and Fudge settled back on their thwarts. She was Gluck, the chief, and I can well imagine that she might have gained her position by her prowess. Gluck fixed her bloodshot eyes upon me. "What is your name?" she bellowed. "David," I replied. "Where are you from?" "From the land of Sari." "How do you make sticks kill with smoke and a loud noise?" she demanded. From what I had heard of their previous conversation, I knew that the question would eventually be forthcoming, and I had my answer ready, for I knew that they could never understand a true explanation of rifles and gunpowder. "It is done by magic known only to the men of Sari," I replied. "Hand him your paddle, Rump," ordered Gluck. As I took the paddle, I thought that she was going to make me help propel the canoe, but that was not in her mind at all. "Now," she said, "use your magic to make smoke and a loud noise come from that stick, but see that you do not kill anybody." "It is the wrong kind of a stick," I said. "I can do nothing with it," and handed it back to Rump. "What kind of a stick is it then?" she demanded. "It is a very strong reed that grows only in Sari," I replied. "I think you are lying to me. After we get to Oog, you had better find some of those sticks if you know what's good for you." As they paddled up through the narrow gorge, they got to discussing me. I may say that they were quite unreserved in their comments. The consensus of opinion seemed to be that I was too feminine to measure up to their ideal of what a man should be. "Look at his arms and legs," said Fudge. "He's muscled like a woman." "No sex appeal at all," commented Rump. "Well, we can put him to work with the other slaves," said Gluck. "He might even help with the fighting if the village is raided." Fudge nodded. "That's about all he'll be good for." Presently we came out of the gorge into a large valley where I could see open plains and forests, and on the right bank of the river a village. This was the village of Oog, our destination, the village of which Gluck was the chief. Chapter 3. Oog was a primitive village. The walls of the huts were built of a bamboo-like reed set upright in the ground and interwoven with a long, tough grass. The roofs were covered with many layers of large leaves. In the center of the village was Gluck's hut, which was larger than the others which surrounded it in a rude circle. There was no palisade and no means of defense. Like their village, these people were utterly primitive, their culture being of an extremely low order. They fabricated a few earthenware vessels, which bore no sort of decoration, and wove a few very crude baskets. Their finest craftsmanship went into the building of their canoes, but even these were very crude affairs. Their slingshots were of the simplest kind. They had a few stone axes and knives, which were considered treasures, and as I never saw any being fabricated while I was among these people, I am of the opinion that they were taken from prisoners who hailed from countries outside the valley. Their smokesticks were evidently their own invention, for I have never seen them elsewhere. Yet I wonder how much better I could have done with the means at their command. Perry and I used often to discuss the helplessness of 20th century man when thrown upon his own resources. We touch a button and we have light and think nothing of it, but how many of us could build a generator to produce that light? We ride on trains as a matter of course, but how many of us could build a steam engine? How many of us could make paper or ink or the 1001 little commonplace things we use every day? Could you refine, or even if you could recognize it when you found it? Could you even make a stone knife with no more tools at your command than those possessed by the men of the Old Stone Age, which consisted of nothing but their hands and other stones? If you think the first steam engine was a marvel of ingenuity, how much more ingenuity must it have taken to conceive and make the first stone knife? Do not look down with condescension upon the men of the Old Stone Age, for their culture, by comparison with what had gone before, was greater than yours. Consider, for example, what marvelous inventive genius must have been his who first conceived the idea and then successfully created fire by artificial means. That nameless creature of a forgotten age was greater than Edison. As our canoe approached the riverbank opposite the village, I was unbound, and when we touched I was yanked roughly ashore. The other canoes followed us and were pulled up out of the water. A number of warriors had come down to greet us, and behind them huddled the men and the children, all a little fearful it seemed of the blustering women warriors. I aroused only a mild curiosity. The women who had not seen me before looked upon me rather contemptuously. "Whose is he?" asked one. "He's not much of a prize for a whole day's expedition." "He's mine," said Gluck. "I know he can fight because I've seen him, and he ought to be able to work as well as a woman. He's husky enough." "You can have him," said the other. "I wouldn't give him room in my hut." Gluck turned toward the men. "Glulla," she called, "come and get this. Its name is David. It will work in the field. See that it has food and see that it works." A hairless, effeminate little man came forward. "Yes, Gluck," he said in a thin voice. "I will see that he works." I followed Glulla toward the village, and as we passed among the other men and children, 3 of the former and 3 children followed along with us, all eyeing me rather contemptuously. "These are Rumla, Fulla and Gila," said Glulla, "and these are Gluck's children." "You don't look much like a man," said Rumla, "but then neither do any of the other men that we capture outside of the valley. It must be a strange world out there, where the men look like women and the women look like men, but it must be very wonderful to be bigger and stronger than your women." "Yes," said Gila. "If I were bigger and stronger than Gluck, I'd beat her with a stick every time I saw her." "So would I," said Glulla. "I'd like to kill the big beast." "You don't seem very fond of Gluck," I said. "Did you ever see a man who was fond of a woman?" demanded Fulla. "We hate the brutes." "Why don't you do something about it, then?" I asked. "What can we do?" he demanded. "What can we poor men do against them? If we even talk back to them, they beat us." They took me to Gluck's hut, and Glulla pointed out a spot just inside the door. "You can make your bed there," he said. It seemed that the choice locations were at the far end of the hut away from the door, and the reason for this, I learned later, was that the men were all afraid to sleep near the door for fear raiders would come and steal them. They knew what their trials and burdens were in Oog, but they didn't know but what they might be worse off in either Jeff or Julok, the other 2 villages of the valley, which with the village of Oog were always warring upon one another, raiding for men and slaves. The beds in the hut were merely heaps of grass, and Glulla went with me and helped me gather some for my own bed. Then he took me just outside the village and showed me Gluck's garden patch. Another man was working in it. He was an upstanding-looking chap, evidently a prisoner from outside the valley. He was hoeing with a sharpened stick. Glulla handed me a similar crude tool, and set me to work beside the other slave. Then he returned to the village. After he was gone, my companion turned to me, My name is Zor, he said. And mine is David, I replied. I am from Sari. Sari. I have heard of it. It lies beside the Laurel Az. I am from Zoram. I have heard much of Zoram, I said. It lies in the mountains of the Thipdars. From whom have you heard of Zoram? He asked. From Janna, the red flower of Zoram, I replied. And from Thor, her brother. Thor is my good friend, said Zor. Janna went away to another world with her man. You have slept here many times? I asked. Many times, he replied. And there is no escape? They watch us very closely. There are always sentries around the village, for they never know when they may expect a raid. And these sentries watch us also. Sentries or no sentries, I said. I don't intend staying here the rest of my natural life. Some time an opportunity must come when we might escape. The other shrugged. Perhaps, he said. But I doubt it. However, if it ever does, I am with you. Good. We'll both be on the lookout for it. We should keep together as much as possible. Sleep at the same time so that we may be awake at the same time. To what woman do you belong? To Rump. She's a Shijalak if there ever was one. And you? I belong to Gluck. She's worse. Keep out of the hut as much as you can when she's in it. Do your sleeping while she's away hunting or raiding. She seems to think that slaves don't need any sleep. If she ever finds you asleep, she'll kick and beat you to within an inch of your life. Sweet character, I commented. They are all pretty much alike, replied Zor. They have none of the natural sensibilities of women and only the characteristics of the lowest and most brutal types of men. How about their men? I asked. Oh, they're a decent lot, but scared of their lives. Before you've been here long, you'll realize that they have a right to be. We had been working while we talked, for the eyes of the sentries were almost constantly upon us. These sentries were posted around the village so that no part of it was left open to a surprise attack, and likewise all of the slaves were constantly under observation as they worked in the gardens. These warrior women sentries were hard taskmasters, permitting no relaxation from the steady grind of hoeing and weeding. If a slave wished to go to his master's hut and sleep, he must first obtain permission from one of the sentries, and more often than not it was refused. I do not know how long I worked in the gardens of Gluck the chief. I was not permitted enough sleep, and so I was always half dead from fatigue. The food was coarse and poor, and was rationed to us slaves none too bountifully. Half starved, I once picked up a tuber which I had unearthed while hoeing, and turning my back on the nearest sentry, commenced to gnaw upon it. Notwithstanding my efforts of concealment, however, the creature saw me, and came lumbering forward. She grabbed the tuber from me and stuck it into her own great mouth, and then she aimed a blow at me that would have put me down for the count had it landed, but it didn't. I ducked under it. That made her furious, and she aimed another at me. Again I made her miss, and by this time she was livid with rage and whooping like an Apache, applying to me all sorts of vile Polycidarian epithets. She was making so much noise that she attracted the attention of the other sentries and the women in the village. Suddenly she drew her bone knife and came for me with murder in her eye. Up to this time I had simply been trying to avoid her blows, for Zor had told me that to attack one of these women would probably mean certain death. But now it was different. She was evidently intent upon killing me, and I had to do something about it. Like most of her kind, she was awkward, muscle-bound and slow, and she telegraphed every move that she was going to make, so I had no trouble in eluding her when she struck at me, but this time I did not let it go at that. Instead I swung my right to her jaw with everything that I had behind it, and she went down and out as cold as a cucumber. You'd better run, whispered Zor. Of course you can't escape, but at least you can try, and you'll surely be killed if you remain here. I took a quick look around in order to judge what my chances of escape might be. They were nil. The women running from the village were almost upon me. They could have brought me down with their slingshots long before I could have gotten out of range, so I stood there waiting as the women lumbered up, and when I saw that Gluck was in the lead I realized that the outlook was rather bleak. The woman I had felled had regained consciousness and was coming to her feet, still a little groggy, as Gluck stopped before us and demanded an explanation. I was eating a tuber, I explained, when this woman came and took it away from me and tried to beat me up. When I eluded her blows she lost her temper, and tried to kill me. Gluck turned to the woman I had knocked down. You tried to beat one of my men? She demanded. He stole food from the garden, replied the woman. It doesn't make any difference what he did, growled Gluck. Nobody can beat one of my men and get away with it. If I want them beaten, I'll beat them myself. Perhaps this will teach you to leave my men alone. And with that she hauled off and knocked the other down. Then she stepped closer and commenced to kick the prostrate woman in the stomach and face. The latter, whose name was Gung, seized one of Gluck's feet and tripped her. Then followed one of the most brutal fights I have ever witnessed. They pounded, kicked, clawed, scratched, and bit one another like two furies. The brutality of it sickened me. If these women were the result of taking women out of slavery and attempting to raise them to equality with man, then I think that they and the world would be better off if they were returned to slavery. One of the sexes must rule, and man seems temperamentally better fitted for the job than woman. Certainly if full power over man has resulted in debauching and brutalizing women to such an extent, then we should see that they remain always subservient to man, whose overlordship is, more often than not, tempered by gentleness and sympathy. The battle continued for some time, first one being on top and then another. Gung had known from the first that it was either her life or Gluck's, and so she fought with the fury of a cornered beast. I shall not further describe this degrading spectacle. Suffice it to say that Gung really never had a chance against the powerful, brutal Gluck, and presently she lay dead. Gluck, certain that her antagonist was dead, rose to her feet and faced me. You are the cause of this, she said. Gung was a good warrior and a fine hunter, and now she is dead. No man is worth that. I should have let her kill you, but I'll remedy that mistake. She turned to Zor. Get me some sticks, slave, she commanded. What are you going to do? I asked. I am going to beat you to death. You're a fool, Gluck, I said. If you had any brains, you would know that the whole fault is yours. You do not let your slaves have enough sleep. You overwork them and you starve them. And then you think that they should be beaten and killed because they steal food or fight in self-defense. Let them sleep and eat more, and you'll get more work out of them. What you think isn't going to make much difference after I get through with you, growled Gluck. Presently Zor returned with a bundle of sticks from among which Gluck selected a heavy one and came toward me. Possibly I am no Samson, but neither am I any weakling, and I may say without boasting that one cannot survive the dangers and vicissitudes of the Stone Age for 36 years, unless he is capable of looking after himself at all times. My strenuous life here has developed a physique that was already pretty nearly tops when I left the outer crust, and in addition to this I had brought with me a few tricks that the men of the old Stone Age had never heard of, nor the women either. So when Gluck came for me I eluded her first blow and, seizing her wrist in both hands, turned quickly and threw her completely over my head. She landed heavily on one shoulder but was up again and coming for me almost immediately, so mad that she was practically foaming at the mouth. As I had thrown her, she had dropped the stick with which she had intended to beat me to death. I stooped and recovered it, and before she could reach me, I swung a terrific blow that landed squarely on top of her cranium. Down she went, down and out. The other women warriors looked on in amazement for a moment, then one of them came for me, and several others closed in. I didn't need the evidence of the Stone Age invectives they were hurling at me to know that they were pretty sore, and I realized that my chances were mighty slim. In fact, they were nil against such odds. I had to do some very quick thinking right then. Wait, I said, backing away from them. You have just seen what Gluck does to women who abuse her men. If you know what's good for you, you'll wait until she comes to. Well, that sort of made them hesitate, and presently they turned their attention from me to Gluck. She was laid out so cold that I didn't know but that I had killed her, but presently she commenced to move, and after a while she sat up. She looked around in a daze for a moment or two, and then her eyes alighted on me. The sight of me seemed to recall to her mind what had just transpired. She came slowly to her feet and faced me. I stood ready and waiting, still grasping the stick. All eyes were upon us, but no one moved or said anything, and then at last Gluck spoke. You should have been a woman, she said, and then turning she started back toward the village. Aren't you going to kill him? Demanded Fudge. I have just killed one good warrior. I am not going to kill a better one, snapped Gluck. When there is fighting, he will fight with the women. When they had all left, Zor and I resumed our work in the garden. Presently Gung's men came and dragged her corpse down to the river, where they rolled it in. Burial is a simple matter in Oog, and the funeral rites are without ostentation. Morticians and florists would starve to death in Oog. It was all quite practical. There was no hysteria. The fathers of her children simply dragged her along by her hairy legs, laughing and gossiping and making ribald jests. That, I said to Zor, must be the lowest and the saddest to which a human being can sink, that he go to his grave unmourned. You will be going down to the river yourself pretty soon, said Zor, but I promise you that you'll have one mourner. What makes you think that I'll be going down to the river so soon? Gluck will get you yet, he replied. I don't think so. I think Gluck's a pretty good sport, the way she took her beating. Good sport nothing, he scoffed. She'd have killed you the moment she came to, if she hadn't been afraid of you. She's a bully, and like all bullies she's a coward. Sometime when you're asleep, she'll sneak up on you and bash your brains out. You tell the nicest bedtime stories, Zor, I said. Chapter 4. Of course, the principal topic of conversation between Zor and me was for some time concerned with my set to with Gluck, and prophesied on Zor's part that I was already as good as dead, just an animated corpse, in fact. But after I had slept twice and nothing had happened to me, we drifted on to other topics, and Zor told me how he happened to be so far from Zoram, and what had led to his capture by the warrior women of Oog. Zor, it seemed, had been very much in love with a girl of Zoram, who one day wandered too far from the village and was picked up by a party of raiders from another country. Zor immediately set out upon the trail of the abductors, which carried him through many strange lands for what he estimated to have been 100 sleeps. Of course, it was impossible to know how far he had traveled, but he must have covered an enormous distance, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 miles, but he never overtook the girl's abductors, and finally he was captured by a tribe living in a palisade village in the heart of a great forest. I was there for many sleeps, he said, my life constantly in danger, for they were instantly threatening to kill me to appease someone they called ogre. Without any apparent reason at all, I quite suddenly became an honored guest instead of a prisoner. No explanation whatever was made to me. I was allowed to go and come as I pleased, and naturally at the first opportunity I escaped. Inasmuch as there are several villages of these Jukans in the forest, I hesitated to go on in that direction for fear of being captured by some of the other villagers, and so I climbed out of the valley with the intention of making a wide detour, but after I came down out of the mountains into this valley, I was captured. Where does the valley of the Jukans lie? I asked. There, he said, pointing in the direction of the snow-capped mountains that bordered one side of the valley. That, I think, is the direction I shall have to go to reach Sari, I said. You think? He demanded. Don't you know? I shook my head. I haven't that peculiar instinct that the Pellucidarians have, which inevitably guides them toward their homes. That is strange, he said. I can't imagine anyone not being able to go directly toward his home, no matter where he may be. Well, I am not a Pellucidarian, you see, I explained, and so I have not that instinct. Not a Pellucidarian? He demanded. But there is nobody in the world who is not a Pellucidarian. There are other worlds than Pellucidar, Zor, even though you may never have heard of them, and I am from one of those other worlds. It lies directly beneath our feet, perhaps 20 sleeps distant. He shook his head. You are not by any chance a Jukan, are you? He asked. They too have many peculiar ideas. I laughed. No, I am not a Jukan, I assured him. And then I tried to explain to him about that other world on the outer crust, but of course it was quite beyond his powers of comprehension. I always thought you were from Sari, he said. I am now. It is my adopted country. There was a girl from Sari among the Jukans, he said. She was not a prisoner in the village where I was, but in another village a short distance away. I heard them talking about her. Some said they were going to kill her to appease Ogre. They were always doing something to appease this person Ogre, of whom they were terribly afraid. And then I heard that they were going to make her a queen. They were always changing their minds like that. What was the girl's name? I asked. I never heard it, he said, but I did hear that she was very beautiful. She is probably dead now, poor thing. But of course one can never tell about the Jukans. They may have made her a queen. They may have killed her. Or they may have let her escape. By the way, I said, what is the direction of Sari? You know, I was only guessing at it. You were right. If you were ever to escape, which you never will, you would have to cross those mountains there. And that would take you into the valley of the Jukans, so you'd still be about as bad off as you are now. If I should ever escape, I'd have to go the same way in order to get on the trail of the people who stole Rana. Then we'll go together, I said. Zor laughed. When you get your mind set on anything, you never give up, do you? I'll certainly not give up the idea of escaping, I told him. Well, it's nice to think about, but that's as far as we'll ever get with all these bewhiskered Shijalaks watching us every minute. An opportunity is bound to come, I said. In the meantime, look what else is coming, he exclaimed, pointing up the valley. I looked in the direction he indicated and saw a strange sight. Even as far away as they were, I recognized them as enormous birds upon which human beings were mounted. Those are the Julaks, said Zor, and at the same time he shouted to a sentry and pointed. Immediately the alarm was raised and our warrior women came pouring out of the village. They carried knives and slingshots and the reeds which they fired to make their smoke screen. About every 10th warrior carried a torch from which the others might light their reeds. As Gluck came out of the village, she tossed us each a knife and a slingshot, handed us smoke reeds, and told us to join the women in the defense of the village. We moved out in what might be described as a skirmish line to meet the enemy, which was close enough now so that I could see them distinctly. The warriors were women, bushy-bearded and coarse like those of the village of Oog, and their mounts were dials, huge birds closely resembling the foraracos, the Patagonian giant of the Miocene, remains of which have been found on the outer crust. They stand 7 to 8 feet in height, with heads larger than that of a horse and necks about the same thickness as those of horses. 3-toed feet terminate their long and powerful legs, which propel their heavy talons with sufficient force to fell an ox, while their large, powerful beaks render them a match for some of the most terrible of the carnivorous mammals and dinosaurs of the inner world. Having only rudimentary wings, they cannot fly, but their long legs permit them to cover the ground at amazing speed. There were only about 20 of the Julak warrior women. They came toward us slowly at first, and then, when about 100 yards away, charged. Immediately our women lighted their torches and hurled them at the advancing enemy, and following this, they loosed their dart-like missiles upon the foe from their slingshots. Not all of the torches had been thrown at first, so that there were plenty in reserve as the enemy came closer to the blinding smoke. Now they were upon us, and I saw our women fighting like furies, with fearless and reckless abandon. They leaped into close quarters, trying to stab the dials or drag their riders from their backs. The smoke was as bad for us, of course, as it was for the enemy, and I was soon almost helpless from choking and coughing. Zor was fighting beside me, but we were not much help to our cause, as neither of us was proficient in the use of the slingshot. Presently, out of smothering smoke, came a riderless dial, the leather thong which formed its bridle dragging on the ground. Instantly an inspiration seized me, and I grasped the bridle rein of the great bird. "Quick!" cried to Zor. "Perhaps this is the chance we have been waiting for. Mount the thing." He did not hesitate an instant, and with my assistance scrambled to the back of the great bird, which was confused and helpless by the smoke that it had inhaled. Then Zor gave me a hand up behind him. We didn't know anything about controlling the creature, but we pulled its head around in the direction we wanted to go, and then kicked its sides with our sandaled feet. It started slowly at first, groping its way through the smoke, but finally, when we came out where it was clearer and it sensed an opportunity to escape from the acrid fumes, it lit out like a scared rabbit, and it was with difficulty that Zor and I maintained our seats. We headed straight for the mountains, on the other side of which lay the country of the Jukans, with little fear that our escape would be noticed until after the battle was over and the smoke had cleared away. That was a ride. Nothing but another dial or an express train could have overtaken us. The creature was frightened and was really bolting. However, we were still able to guide it in the direction we wished to go. When we reached the foothills, it was tired and was compelled to slow down, and after that we moved at a decorous pace up toward the higher mountains. And they were high. Snow-capped peaks loomed above us, an unusual sight in Pellucidar. "This is an ideal way to cover ground," I said to Zor. "I have never traveled so rapidly in Pellucidar before. We are certainly fortunate to have captured this dial, and I hope that we can find food for him." "If there's any question about that," replied Zor, "the dial will settle it himself." "What do you mean?" I asked. "He'll eat us." Well, he didn't eat us, and we didn't keep him very long, for as soon as we reached the snow, he positively refused to go any farther, and as he became quite belligerent we had to turn him loose. Chapter 5. The climate of Pellucidar is almost eternally spring-like, and therefore the apparel of the inhabitants of this inner world is scant, being seldom more than a loincloth and sandals. The atmosphere near the surface is slightly denser than that of the outer crust because of centrifugence, but for the same reason it is much shallower than that of the exterior of the globe, with the result that it is extremely cold upon the heights of the higher mountains, so you may well imagine that Zor and I did not linger long in the snows of the upper levels. He had crossed the mountains by this same pass when he had come out of the valley of the Jukans, so we were not delayed by the necessity for searching out a crossing. The sun beat down upon us out of a clear sky, but it was still intensely cold, and in our almost naked state we could not have survived long. I can assure you that it was with a feeling of relief that we crossed the summit of the divide and started down the other slope. We were both numb with cold before we reached a warmer level. The trail we followed had been made by game passing from one valley to another, and we were lucky that we met none of the carnivorous species while we were above the timberline. Afterward, of course, we had the sanctuary of the trees into which to escape them. Our arms were most inadequate, for a stone knife is a poor weapon against a cave bear, the mighty arwich of the inner world, which stands 8 feet at the shoulders and measures fully 12 feet in length, doubtless a perfect replica of Ursus Spilius, which roamed the outer crust contemporaneously with Paleolithic man. Nor were our slingshots much less futile, since we were far from proficient in their use. Perhaps you can imagine how helpless one might feel, almost naked and practically unarmed, in this savage world. I often marvel that man survived at all, either here or upon the outer crust. He is by nature so poorly equipped either for offense or defense. It is claimed that environment has a great deal to do with the development of species, and so it has always seemed strange to me, if this be true, that man is not fully as fleet of foot as the antelope, for in the environment in which he lived for ages he must have spent a great many of his waking hours running away from something. Great beasts, which not even by the wildest stretch of the imagination could he have been supposed to have met and overcome with his bare hands, or even with a club or a knife. Personally, I feel that the human race must have developed in a wooded country where there was always a tree handy to offer a man an avenue of escape from the terrible creatures that must have been constantly hunting him. Well, we finally got down where it was warmer and where there were plenty of trees, and it was very fortunate for us too that there were trees, for the very first living creature that we met after negotiating the pass was a pteryg, an enormous striped cat, the replica of which, our saber-toothed tiger, has long been extinct upon the outer crust. For large animals, they are extraordinarily fleet of foot, and they act so quickly when they sight their prey that unless an avenue of immediate escape is open or their intended victim is sufficiently well armed and alert, the result is a foregone conclusion, and the pteryg feeds. Like all the other carnivorous animals of Pellucidar, they seem to be always hungry, their great carcasses requiring enormous quantities of food to rebuild the tissue wasted by their constant activity. They seem always to be roaming about. I do not recall ever having seen one of them lying down. The pteryg that we met, Zor and I chanced to see simultaneously, which was at the very instant that he saw us. He didn't pause an instant but charged immediately at unbelievable speed. Zor and I each voiced a warning and took to a tree. I was directly in the path of the beast as it charged, and having its eye on me it leaped for me, and it almost got me too, its talons just scraping one of my sandals as it sprang high into the air after me. Zor was in an adjoining tree and looked over at me and smiled. "That was a close call," he said. "We'll have to keep a better lookout." "We'll have to have some weapons," I replied. "That is even more important." "I'd like to know where you are going to get them," he said. "I'll make them," I replied. "What kind of weapons?" "Oh, a couple of bows and some arrows to start with and 2 short, heavy hurling spears." "What are bows and arrows?" he asked. I explained them to him as well as I could, but he shook his head. "I'll make myself a spear," he said. "The men of Zoram kill even the Arwich and the Thipdar with the spear. That, and a knife are all the weapons I need." After a while the pteryg went away, And we came down to earth, and a little later we found a place to camp near a small stream. We were fortunate in not having to hunt very long for such a site, for places to camp in Pellucidar, which also mean places to sleep, must offer safety from prowling beasts of prey, and this means ordinarily nothing less than a cave the mouth of which can be barricaded. It is a great world, this, and a great life, but eventually one becomes accustomed to being hunted. At first it used to keep my nerves constantly on edge, but after a while I took it just as casually as you of the outer world accept the jeopardies of traffic, hold-up men, and the other ordinary threats upon your life that civilization affords so abundantly. We found a cave a couple of feet above high water in a cliff the face of which was washed by this mountain stream. A clear, cold stream in which we knew there would lurk no dangerous reptiles, a fact which was quite important to us since we had to wade into the stream to reach our cave. It was an ideal spot, and since neither of us had had sufficient sleep since being captured by the warrior women of Oog, we were glad of the opportunity to lie up in safety until we were thoroughly rested. After investigating the cave and finding it untenanted, dry, and large enough to accommodate us comfortably, we carried in leaves and dry grass for our beds, and were soon asleep. How long I slept I don't know. It may have been an hour or a week of your time, but the important thing was that when I awoke I was thoroughly rested. I may also add that I was ravenously hungry. Chapter 6. One seldom appreciates the little conveniences of everyday life until one is compelled to do without them. The chances are that you own a pocket knife, and that somewhere around the house or the garage there is a chisel and a saw, and perhaps a jack plane and a hatchet and an axe. And it is also quite possible that, being a civilized man as you are, notwithstanding the fact that you have all these edge tools, you might have a devil of a time making a usable bow and the arrows to go with it, even though you had access to a lumber yard where you might select the proper materials cut more or less to the sizes you required. At the same time, you would have plenty of food in the pantry and the refrigerator, and there wouldn't be any large, inconsiderate beasts of prey lying in wait for you. The conditions would be ideal and you could take all the time you required, but you would still have quite a job cut out for you. Consider then your situation should you have at your disposal only a stone knife, your bare hands, and your materials on the hoof, as you might say. Add to this that you were hungry and that the filling of your belly depended largely upon the possession of a bow and arrow, to say nothing of the preservation of your life from the attacks of innumerable savage creatures which hungered for your flesh. This latter situation was the one in which I found myself after I awoke from my long sleep, but it really didn't give me undue concern, as I was by this time fully inured to the vicissitudes of life in the Stone Age. Zora woke shortly after and we went out together to search for materials for our weapons. We knew exactly what we wanted and it didn't take us long to find it in the lush vegetation of Pellucidar, notwithstanding the fact that hardwoods are more or less scarce. A species of the genus Taxus is more or less widely distributed throughout Pellucidar, and I had discovered that its wood made the best bows. For arrows I used a straight, hollow reed that becomes very hard when dry. The tips which I inserted in the end of the reeds were of wood, fire-hardened. A modern archer of the civilized outer world would doubtless laugh at the crude bow I made then at the edge of the valley of the Jukans. If he uses a yew bow, the wood for it was allowed to season for 3 years before it was made into a bow, and then the bow was probably not used for 2 more years, but I could not wait 5 years before eating, and so I hacked the limb I had selected from the tree with my stone knife and took the bark from it and tapered it crudely from the center toward each end. I prefer a 6-foot, 80-pound bow for a 3-foot arrow, because of the great size and formidability of some of the beasts one meets here. But of course my bow did not attain this strength immediately. Every time we had a fire, I would dry it out a little more, so that it gradually attained its full efficiency. The strings for my bows I can make from several long-fibered plants, but even the best of them do not last long, and I am constantly having to renew them. While I was making my bow and arrows, Zor fashioned a couple of the short heavy spears such as are used by the warriors of Zoram. They are formidable weapons but only effective under 100 feet, and only at that distance when hurled by a very powerful man, while my arrows can penetrate to the hearts of the largest beasts at a full 100 yards or more. While we were working on our weapons we subsisted upon nuts and fruits, but as soon as they were completed we set out after meat, and this took us down into the valley, a large portion of which was thickly forested. We found the game a little wary, which suggested that it had been hunted, and therefore presupposed the presence of man. I finally made a very poor shot and succeeded only in wounding an antelope which made off into the forest, carrying my arrow with it. As I was quite sure that the wound would eventually bring it down, and as I have never liked to abandon a wounded animal and permit it to suffer, we followed the quarry into the forest. The spoor was plain, for the trail was well marked with blood where the animal passed. Finally we caught up with it, and I dispatched it with another arrow through the heart. I imagine that we relaxed our vigilance a little while we were cutting off a hind quarter, and some of the other choice portions of our kill, for I certainly had no idea that we were not alone until I heard a man speak. "Greetings," said a voice, and looking around I saw fully 20 warriors who had come from among the trees behind us. "Jukins," whispered Zor. There was that about their appearance which was rather startling. Their hair, which was rudely trimmed to a length of an inch or more, grew straight out from their scalps, but I think it was their eyes more than any other feature, which gave them their strange appearance. As a rule, the iris was quite small and the whites of the eyeball showed all around it. Their mouths were flabby and loose, those of many of them constantly hanging open. "Why do you hunt in our forest?" said he who had first spoken. "Because we are hungry," I replied. "You shall be fed then," he said. "Come with us to the village. You shall be welcome guests in the village of Misa, our king." From what Zor had told me of these people, I was not particularly anxious to go to one of their villages. We had hoped to skirt the forest in which their villages are located, and thus avoid them, but now it looked as though we were in for it after all. "There is nothing that we would rather do," I said, "than visit your village, but we are in a great hurry and we are going in the other direction." "You are coming to our village," said the leader. His voice rose and cracked in sudden excitement, and I could see that even the suggestion had angered him. "Yes," said several of the others, "you are coming to our village." They too seemed to be on the verge of losing control of themselves. "Oh, of course," I said. "If you wish us to come, we shall be glad to, but we didn't want to put you to so much trouble." "That is better," said the leader. "Now we shall all go to the village and eat and be happy." "I guess we're in for it," said Zor, as the warriors gathered around us and conducted us farther into the forest. "They may continue to be friendly," he went on, "but one can never tell when their mood will change. All I can suggest is that we humor them as much as possible, for you saw the effect that even the slight suggestion of crossing them had upon them." "Well, we won't cross them then," I said. We marched for some little distance until we came at last to a crudely palisaded village that stood in a small clearing. The warriors at the gate recognized our escort and we were immediately admitted. The village inside the palisade presented a strange appearance. It was evidently laid out according to no plan whatever, the houses having been placed according to the caprice of each individual builder. The result was most confusing, for there was no such thing as a street in the sense in which we understand it, for the spaces between the buildings could not be called streets. Sometimes they were only a couple of feet wide, and sometimes as much as 20 feet, and scarcely ever were they straight for more than the length of a couple of houses. The design of the houses was as capricious as their location, apparently no two of them having been built according to the same plan. Some were built of small logs, some of wattle and mud, some of bark, and there were many entirely of grass over a light framework. They were round or square or oblong or conical. I noted one in particular that was a tower fully 20 feet high, while next to it was a woven grass hut that rose no more than 3 feet above the ground. It had a single opening, just large enough for its occupants to crawl in and out on their hands and knees. In the narrow alleyways between the buildings, wild-eyed children played, women cooked, and men loafed, so it was with the greatest difficulty our escort forced its way toward the center of the village. We were constantly stepping over or around men, women, or children, most of whom paid no attention to us, while others flew into frightful rages if we touched them. We saw some strange sights during that short journey through the village. One man, sitting before his doorway, struck himself a terrific blow on the head with a rock. "Stop," he screamed, "or I'll kill you." "Oh, you will you?" he answered himself and then hit himself again, whereupon he dropped the rock and commenced to choke himself. I do not know how his altercation with himself turned out, for we turned the corner of his house and lost sight of him. A little farther on, we came upon a woman who was holding down a screaming child while she attempted to cut its throat with a stone knife. It was more than I could stand, and though I knew the risk I took, I seized her arm and pulled the knife from the child's throat. "Why are you doing that?" I demanded. "This child has never been sick," she replied, "and so I know there must be something the matter with it. I am putting it out of its misery." Then suddenly, her eyes ablaze, she leaped up and struck at me with her knife. I warded off the blow, and simultaneously one of my escort knocked the woman down with the haft of his spear, while another pushed me roughly forward along the narrow alleyway. "Mind your own business," he screamed, "or you will get in trouble here." "But you are not going to let the woman kill that child, are you?" I demanded. "Why should I interfere with her? I might want to cut somebody's throat someday myself. And I wouldn't want anyone to interfere with my fun. I might even want to cut yours." "Not a bad idea," remarked another warrior. We turned the corner of the house, and a moment later I heard the screams of the child again, but I was helpless to do anything about it, and now I had my own throat to think about. Presently we came to a large open space below a low, rambling, crazy-looking structure. It was the palace of Misa, the king. In the center of the plaza before the palace was a huge, grotesque, obscene figure representing a creature that was part man and part beast. Circling around it were a number of men turning cartwheels. No one seemed to be paying any attention to them, although there were quite a number of people in the square. As we passed the figure, each member of our escort said, "Greetings, ogre," and moved on toward the palace. They made Zor and me salute the hideous thing in the same manner. "That is ogre," said one of our escort. "You must always salute him when you pass. We are all the children of ogre. We owe everything to him. He made us what we are. He gave us our great intelligence. He made us the most beautiful, the richest, the most powerful people in Pellucidar." "Who are those men cavorting around him?" I asked. "Those are the priests of ogre," replied the warrior. "And what are they doing?" I asked. "They are praying for the whole village," he replied. "They save us the trouble of praying. If they didn't pray for us, we'd have to, and praying is very strenuous and tiring." "I should think it might be," I said. We were admitted to the palace, which was as bizarre and mad a structure as I have ever seen, and there the leader of our escort turned us over to another Jucanian, a functionary of the palace. "Here," he said, "are some very good friends who have come to visit Misa and bring him presents. Do not, by any mischance, cut their throats or permit anyone else to do so, lest they have difficulty in talking with Misa, who is anxious, I know, to converse with them." The palace functionary had been sitting on the floor when we entered, nor did he arise or discontinue his activities. Instead, he dismissed our escort and asked Zor and me to sit down and join him. He had dug a hole in the dirt floor with the point of his knife, and into this hole he poured some water which he mixed with the loose earth he had excavated until the contents of the bowl was of the consistency of soft modeling clay. Then he took some in the palm of one hand, shaped it until it was round, patted it flat, and set it carefully on the floor beside him. He inclined his head toward us and waved an inviting hand toward the hole. "Join me, please," he said. "You will find this not only exquisitely entertaining but highly enlightening and character building." So Zor and I joined the palace functionary and made mud pies.